Hey everybody, welcome back to another business analysis video to our series Tips from the Experts. And today we have a seasoned business analyst, the OG of business analysis, as I would say, and one of my mentors unknowingly. When I started as a business analyst, Laura Brandenburg was my go-to person from Bridging the Gap. That was always the website I would visit. When I first started as a business analyst, I've talked to all of you about it. I was so introverted. I was so shy. And Bridging the Gap had so many resources, so many templates, and so many guides on how to embark in business analysis. And it really, really helped me to have that confidence and know that I can actually do it. And here I am now. I can't even believe that she's actually on our series today. So everybody, welcome Laura Brandenburg. Thank you so much for coming on the series.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here, and thank you for doing what you do and sharing on a YouTube channel like this. I know it takes a lot to put a presence and a channel and a whole online resource together. So thank you for your contribution to the community.
Thank you. And you as well. You don't know so much impact you've made in my life as a business analyst. And I know there are so many other business analysts out there that you've helped for many, many years. So thank you also for sharing that knowledge.
I love hearing the stories. It's so amazing of like where everybody has landed. It's really kind of cool to be able to have that kind of impact.
Yes, it's unbelievable as well in some way. I remember the beginning days finding your website, and I never could imagine that I would be here almost 10 years later and talking to you. So yes, it's amazing. It's amazing. In today's series, we'll be exploring requirements because that's one of the key things that we do as business analysts. But before we start, I know a lot about you already, but it would be great to hear from you. If you tell us a little bit about yourself, maybe a little bit about Bridging the Gap, that would be great.
Yeah, so I am, as you mentioned, the founder and CEO of Bridging the Gap. So Bridging the Gap is with hyphens, bridging-the-gap.com. If I ever had to go back or could go back and redo that, I would, but that's the URL we have. We're focused on practical online training in foundational business analysis skills. So skills that people use to get into business analysis, excel within business analysis, and often even come back to years and years as their career grows above and beyond business analysis. But I started my business analysis career after being a quality assurance professional. And at the time, I felt like I just had a lucky break, like I was in the right place at the right time. And it turns out when I went back and looked at my career, I had been doing a lot of business analysis unknowingly, interviewing stakeholders, creating a new test process, which was really a business process, and really understanding the software in our company. And so that sent me on a trajectory of 3 different BA jobs in 3 different companies and 3 different states. I kind of moved to explore some new things and ended up on a team where we were, a new technology team for a centralized company that had acquired 5 portfolio companies. We were really building that tech team from the ground up. And I was thinking of myself as like just the BA, then that became just the BA and the project manager and the QA. And we hired one person to help me. And then before you knew it, like we had a 15-person team and I was like directing that whole team. And it was a really great experience until it wasn't. And then I went off on my own and that's when I started Bridging the Gap 15 years ago. And also was doing some contracting and consulting at the time as well. So I've seen business analysis from like a lot of different perspectives and angles and also continue to learn, I think, in my life as a trainer through the questions people ask and just seeing how these skills continue to resonate and help people be more successful in their careers. So
it's interesting how you also mentioned that you had been doing business analysis without realizing or having the job title of business analysts. It's quite interesting because there are so many people too who do business analysis, are unaware and don't know how to move into business analysis without knowing that they actually already have the experience and the transferable skills. It really is interesting how varied business analysis can be.
Yeah, and I technically never had the quote unquote title business analyst. I was a systems analyst first. And then by the time I learned about the BA profession and like discovered IIBA, I was at a manager level role. So I was manager, and that's when I advocaate for the business analyst title. I was manager business analyst. So I was never technically a pure business analyst by title, but I feel like it's all business analysis, right?
Yes, yes. It's not the job title, it's the work that we do and the services that we provide as business analysts. Yeah, exactly. Thank you for sharing that. So going into today's topic around requirements, I wanted to ask about, especially for viewers, a lot of my viewers are new business analysts or aspiring business analysts. Do you have any sort of tips or guide on how the viewers can effectively capture and write requirements as new business analysts?
Yeah. I think there's so much focus on the writing, and it is so important. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the techniques for that. But like the first thing I would say, especially if you're new, or even if you're coming to this like with some experience, is when we're thinking about the requirements, we always want to start by understanding like what problem we're solving, right? So you can write semantically good, clear, well understood requirements that solve the absolutely wrong problem. And like then the solution doesn't deliver any value. So, before we even start talking about requirements, we want to understand the problem that we're trying to solve. And then as we get into understanding that problem, I find it really helps to look at the requirements from multiple different perspectives. So we teach 3 different views. We teach a business process view, a software or functional requirements view, and then a data modeling or data requirements view. And I find that when you are looking from those different perspectives, often each perspective brings out its own requirements. So a lot of BAs maybe get stuck on just like, what are the functional requirements and thinking about what the software needs to do. But when you look at the business process, you'll be like, oh, there's other things that the software either needs to do or accommodate that I didn't think about until I looked at the bigger picture of the business process. And the same with data modeling, like as well, what does this field do? Or why is this moving over? You start to see different perspectives too. So just, not having just one tool, having a full toolbox of tools that allow you to look at different perspectives as well. And I would say the third tip that I wanted to bring in is that this idea of capturing requirements is it's a collaborative and an often iterative process, right? So as the BA, yes, you want to be writing, but you want to be asking a lot of questions. You want to be analyzing that information you receive and then asking more questions because there's going to be gaps. So like the value you provide is not just in that documentation, it's in the digging and the analyzing and the putting it all together that results in some sort of document that somebody can do something with to implement the solution. But, you really want to pay attention to that collaborative piece as well.
Okay. Yeah, that brings me to a few other questions. So around when you mentioned there are 3 areas of requirements capture, looking at the process view, the functional requirements or the systems view, as well as the data. Do these 3 always come in as part of the requirements work, or it depends on the project?
Yeah, it does depend on the project, and it also depends on the role, right? So sometimes we'll see roles where there's a business process analyst and like a systems or functional analyst, right? So then each one of those might not do all 3 of those areas, but somebody needs to be doing them, right? Or I'll see a lot of BAs who are more process and software focused. They're like, I don't touch the data, right? Because the data feels like, oh, somebody else owns the data. And often though, that means there's a gap in bringing the business perspective into the data. So even if you're not creating the data model, understanding the data model, making sure it represents what the business process flow is and how the software is working. Like it's a really important part. So it's like you're not always doing all of them, but you definitely want awareness of who's doing them and making sure that somebody is looking at all those perspectives.
That's a really great tip. And then when it comes to these gathering and capturing these requirements, as business analysts, we should look at it from a iterative perspective as well as being collaborative. But I'm going back to the start of when I became a business analyst. I wasn't sure what sort of questions I'd be asking, if I was asking the right questions, or if I was going outside scope or in scope of the topic. Do you have any tips you can share around that?
Yeah, well, that's where like before you get into the details of the requirements, really what is the problem we're solving and why? And so, I often will coach people to do a scope statement, like a really short scope statement. In an agile team, you might be doing that in an epic format, but just like a couple page document that here's what problem we're solving. Here's the high level view of the solution. You might have a high level business process flow or a system context diagram, but just something that shows the how the solution is solving that problem. And then when you get into those detailed requirements, then it's like you're breaking down that big picture into smaller details. And so it gives you a guide to start from. But always, you can always start with that, like, why are we doing this? Right? Or some variation on that kind of question.
Definitely. So these are all really great for sort of capturing requirements effectively. We can't only just focus on the documentation. We also have to focus on the communication skills. That always comes into play for business analysts because we're not able to do our work really without speaking to stakeholders, looking at and understanding their perspectives. So that's one impact of not capturing correctly, not communicating effectively. But are you able to share any potential impacts if requirements are not captured correctly, maybe for the business analyst or for the organization or the project?
Yeah, I think we miss things, right? So we miss things, and there's often data that shows the later in the project lifecycle a requirement is found, the more it costs to implement that. So when you're finding a missed requirement in testing or after the solution has been implemented, it's much more expensive. So something that if you had found that earlier would have been less expensive. But I also think like at a more cultural level, when you start to have a pattern of missing the mark with your technology projects, that trust between the business and IT team dissolves, and then you start to have finger pointing or people who don't want to be as involved in your projects, or like we never get what we need from tech, and then tech is like we never get what we need from and then and a lot of BAs are already in this situation where people have been living with that for years, right? So you're trying to rebuild the trust through managing expectations and good communication, but like really like when we miss requirements in a big way, that trust gets dissolved and it becomes a cultural issue in the company. And it also becomes an issue for the business analyst because even though it might be that you asked the question and you didn't get the right answer, it reflects like a missed requirement is like reflects on the business analyst. And so it damages your credibility. It damages the credibility of the role in the organization. And we're just seeing so much happen right now with like product managers and product owners and business analysts and like how the roles are shifting around. And, we put a new title on the role that's been there for a while, trying to a lot of that I think is just because those roles aren't operating in a way to create credibility in their organization. And so the more credibility you can bring, the better the practices will be received. But you got to start with really like getting the requirements right on those projects. It's a big piece of it.
Yeah, it does put a lot of pressure on the business analyst as well on the project.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I know. I don't
definitely.
want to be the one putting even more pressure on you, but it's really it's like the opportunity, right?
Yeah, of course. And I also think with time and practice, especially for newbies, we have that initial fear of asking the right questions, like I said, or capturing the requirements, or focusing on just the documentation and not really building the relationship. But I think with time, you build the experience, you learn from mistakes, and then you're able to sort of add that to the value for the project or for the organization. Yeah.
Yeah, and like the very first time you ask the question and somebody's like, I didn't think about that. I'm so glad you asked that question, right?
Yes.
Those are the moments that you're looking for. And I would guess even for a new business analyst who's thinking analytically and looking at the big picture, like you probably have those moments pretty early on and just really appreciating how special they are and using that as a confidence boost too, that you're on the right track. Because you really don't want to feel like you have to filter your questions unless you're truly not hearing what your stakeholders are telling you and you're kind of asking the same thing over and over again. But that's a different issue.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. It's totally different issue, that one. Okay, so coming back to the capturing the requirements and documenting, how do you prioritize requirements and at the same time manage the stakeholder expectations? Because I know stakeholders have different perspectives, different priorities. For instance, if there are different functions that impact the project, how can business analysts then know which ones within those different functions to prioritize, especially because those stakeholders have their own priorities as well? Can you share some tips on that?
I think the first thing to like most often the business analyst should not be the decision maker, right? So we feel this pressure, like what should the right priorities be? But really our role is to create a structure that helps the business prioritize and make good decisions. So it comes back to what problem are we solving? Why are we investing in this project? And you will always have multiple stakeholders, and often multiple stakeholders will be perceived as like decision makers, but there's a reason and there's a sponsor behind the sponsors. So just always being aware of like who's really the chief sponsor, what problem are we trying to solve, how can I weave in some of these other interests because they're in service of the bigger problem or maybe other initiatives. But inviting people to clarify, like if they have a stake or an opinion about what's important, is that really the piece that belongs in this project, right? And so having that kind of communication. And then in a meeting, I like to be really clear, like what's in and out of scope, or, we had a whole sidebar today about this because we kind of went down a tangent, but I just wanted to be clear, like that's on our backlog or that's getting parking lotted for now, and just consistently reinforcing what parts of what discussions are in and what parts are not, I think is really important for the BA to do. Because it's easy for someone to leave a meeting and be like, oh, we spent like 20 minutes talking about my favorite thing, so it's going to get done, and just write it off. And when that's not really what you were trying to communicate at all.
It also brings me back to other scenarios where, say, in a workshop discussing requirements and the stakeholders could go out of scope, way out of scope. It still brings it back again to that key communication skills for business analysts to try and bring the stakeholder back to the room. That can also be quite difficult for business analysts. Any tips on how to bring the stakeholder back into the room?
I think it starts with how you start the meeting. So having a clear outcome, having an agenda, having a purpose, even like, this is an interesting conversation. We have a little bit of extra time. Let's spend some time brainstorming it so that we can all be thinking about it, but it's not what we're doing, just, and then if they're really off on a tangent, like, I'm sorry, like that's out of scope. We are focused on this, and you kind of need to have that outcome that you're going for the meeting. And ideally that outcome is also something that's important to them. So like you can have a consequence, like, if we spend all the time talking about this, we're not going to be able to clarify this set of requirements, and development's going to start late, right? And the project is, so you start to kind of link the distractions to the delays or the extra time or the extra budget. And sometimes that can start to have a positive effect, but it's really hard to rein in
It is,
stakeholders.
isn't it? Yeah.
I don't want to like underestimate that. Like, and sometimes, especially as a new BA, you don't know what, like I've had experiences where, even as a really senior BA, but I'm in a new domain and it's not clear for like 10 minutes that what this person is talking about is really out of scope, or it's in scope, but it seems out of scope to me, but they're like making a very, like they're coming around to it. And so it can be really challenging, especially when you're learning that domain. And so just using like the end of the meeting to really recap and reframe, and meeting notes and summaries, and, using some of that written communication to kind of capture the essence at the end too.
Yes.
Or I
Those
like
are
I have to ask somebody like, I'm sorry, I'm new here. Like, I don't see how this is going to pull back
Mm,
to like to what we're talking about. And they'll be like, no,
yeah.
no, I'm getting there. Or, oh, right, you're right. I'm kind of off track. So it's really challenging.
It is very challenging. And another challenge that comes for me, again, going back to when I became a business analyst, it was the fear of authority. Having certain senior level stakeholders in a meeting, for instance, and yeah, just having that fear of how do I communicate to this stakeholder that this is not the topic for discussion for today. Um, it can be quite challenging, yeah.
For sure, for sure. But
Yeah.
even senior level stakeholders need to be reined in at times. Like they can be the worst, right? At
Yeah.
taking you off track. Like you're taking the whole, like that's where like an offline discussion, like when you come in and do that, you're taking the whole team off
Yeah.
track. And I'm like working so hard to keep people focused,
Mm.
can be a good relationship building tool
Yeah.
too.
So, as part of this sort of scenario as well in capturing requirements, sometimes business analysts experience ambiguous or conflicting requirements. Can you share some approach to how to handle this scenario?
Yeah, I kind of think of those as a little bit different.
Yeah.
So, yeah, like ambiguous meaning somebody's not really clear about what their requirement is, or
Yeah.
says something like, I just want a better screen or an easier to use workflow, right? And so, starting with that's where I like to start with some sort of model. So, understand what I can, and then sometimes it might be, okay, let's talk about the business process. I think it starts here and ends here. What are the steps you envision in between?
Mhm.
Or I heard what you said, and I put together this wireframe that captures what might be a solution that you're talking about. What do you think about it? Right. And not thinking of those documents or those deliverables as final or like up for review so much as like I think of them almost like coffee table books. Like they're just there to start a conversation. And so
Mm.
you're putting something together because then you're getting that yes, but response. Like, yes, that's right, but, or just like, no, that's completely different than what I was talking about. But you're starting to help people take something that's kind of fuzzy and be more concrete about it by putting it into an analysis model like that.
Mhm.
Um, that's usually how I try to approach ambiguous requirements is just,
Yeah.
iteratively getting to more and more clarity as you get through the models.
That's a good approach. That's a good approach. I think that's the same one I would take as well. Is going back to ask the right questions, try to understand what that ambiguous requirement is, and continuously review it with the stakeholder.
Yeah, and take what you hear, put it into some sort of written or visual form, and
Yeah.
then
Visual
and then
form.
get feedback, like because then you're gonna start to get the crystallization from that.
Visual representation, it really is helpful for requirements capture rather than just written words. Having that some sort of picture representation helps understanding for both stakeholders as well as us as business analysts, I think. Yeah, yeah. Okay, coming to our final question. Can you share some tools or techniques that you find most effective for maintaining clarity and organization in your documents?
Yeah, I'm still pretty basic when it comes to this. I love folders, right? So
Oh,
like having a folder for each project or each category of work that I'm working on, and having a good folder structure is really important. I actually just got this new Remarkable. So like
what is
it's like
that?
it's a notepad that you can write
Oh,
on. So
yeah.
I've transitioned from paper notes to like
Oh, cool.
electronic, but still
Yeah.
handwritten notes. And it's like the first time in ages that I've created a new file folder structure because the first several days it's like, oh, I'm just going to create a new document, create a new document. And I'm like, I need to like organize this in some way. But folders for major types of work. In my case, it's like I have a connections one, team meetings, upcoming book projects. So some more project focused. And then from a business analysis perspective, I like that main folder to have my high level documents. So my scope statement, my glossary, maybe if I have one, an issues list where I'm keeping track of what are all the open issues for that project and who's responsible for resolving them or what's the next step. Kind of a great tool to help with action items. And then a folder, subfolders for like my meeting notes or a way to capture decisions. And then like you might have a subfolder for your business process documents and your use cases and your data models. So you're like keeping that all organized, but then you've got to capture, like your team is probably gonna be working in a tool, right? So you might have your contextual information in your wiki or your folder structure, whatever, but you got to link out to that tool or link back in some way. But using the tool whenever you can, especially as you get into those detailed requirements. So you're not trying to maintain things in a bunch of different places.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, I don't know if that's a great strategy, but that's kind of how I manage things.
Yeah, of course, that's great. And then you mentioned about linking them back, and of course, a lot of documentation we create, we collaborate on those documents as well. We share it with stakeholders and team members. So it's good to always link that somewhere, whether it's something like Confluence, for instance, or emails maybe, or team spaces.
Right, or whatever. Yeah, so usually I think most companies these days have some document sharing capability.
Yes, like SharePoint. Something like that.
You want to manage as much as you can in that system versus your own system, I would say.
You mentioned about this electronic handwritten note. I'm quite interested in that. For me, what I mainly do is I still like working on paper, and writing just like you. But sometimes when taking notes during requirements capture, for instance, you can't write as fast as the speaker. So I type a lot of the time, and I use OneNote, which has been really, really good for me.
There's amazing things about OneNote.
Yeah.
On my list because it integrates with this Remarkable now. Because I've been on pen and paper and physical file folders for a long time. I'm like, I need to get up with the 2000s, right?
I know. Yeah. I'll definitely check out Remarkable as well. Thank you for sharing.
But yeah, what are your tips for using OneNote? I've heard such great things about it.
For OneNote, it's generally for managing, planning my week, planning my day, taking notes as well. So it has a structure where you can have separate areas within it, like sort of folders. You can title them, and it's just easy to find. It's a really good tool. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our topic today. But before we go, do you have any final tips to share for viewers, aspiring business analysts, and newbie business analysts?
Yeah, I would say, we talk so much about understanding the problem to be solved, but I think what I would want to leave people with is the confidence and inspiration to just ask the questions, right? If anything, when I see like newer business analysts struggle with like not wanting to be a bother to people, not wanting to overtax people's time or feeling like they're wasting people's time, and really, turning that around. Like, what is the value that you're creating for them? Like you helping them get clear and understand what they want and take the next step. Like that is going to help the project be more successful. It's going to help them be more successful in their roles. It's going to help you be more successful. So just, focusing on that value and using that as a way to stir up some confidence and to ask the question, even if it feels like you're the only one in the room that doesn't understand it. Because often those are the questions that need to get asked and answered, and you will be kicking yourself in a few months for not having asked it when it causes a big issue that then everybody's so frustrated about. So better to ask it than not.
And someone mentioned today in one of my meetings, the silliest question is asking no question. So there's nothing like a silly question. Just ask. Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to have you on the series. Thank you for taking the time as well to share your knowledge.
Thank you so much for having me here.
It's been great. Thanks everybody for watching. As always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this content. You'd never know who it might help. Until I see you in my next one. Peace.